Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you are all having a good end of your week. Today we'll be talking about the early Middle Ages and the migration of peoples. This is going to be the last lecture for this week, and I will not upload any new ones for next week, probably not until the end of the weekend. Just as a few reminders, and I failed to include it here, but first and foremost, your first source analysis, which is your first writing assignment, is due Sunday, May 10th by 11:59 p.m. You will submit this to the Dropbox on e-learning, marked as Source Analysis 1. Please review the Source Analysis Guide version 2 in content, source analysis prompts. The text you are going to be writing on is The Dream of the Rood, part of the primary readings for today's lecture. Dream of the Rood can be found under Content 5.8, Early Middle Ages and the Migration of Peoples, and in the Primary Readings PDF. You must answer all parts of the prompt to get full credit on everything. And I strongly suggest, if you are not familiar, to read Matthew 16 as it suggests in the prompt. Pay particular attention to how Jesus... to the differences in how Jesus reacts to the crucifixion between the Dream of the Rood and in the Bible. And for clarification purposes, this is something that a lot of students are not always able to pick up every time they read this, is that the Dream of the Rood has multiple narrators. It does not take the point of view of just one single person. It begins with with a narration by a guy who had a dream vision, and then it switches to the main narrator of the dream vision, which is Jesus' crucifix. At no point is the narrator anybody other than one of these two people. So it begins with a narration by a guy who had a dream vision. It then switches to the point of view of the tree that becomes Jesus' crucifix, and then it switches back to the point of view of the guy who had the dream. Keep that in mind as you read it, and hopefully that helps avoid any confusion. One of the things I forgot to include on this slide is that your first set of discussion board posts will be due once again at 11:59 p.m. This Sunday. As a reminder, you must respond or make at least 4 posts in the discussion boards for this week, and at least one of them must be you starting your own thread, and at least one of them must be you responding to somebody else's thread. Okay? Alright, with that out of the way, I'm also trying a new method once again to see if this works better and is easier for everyone, so that I don't need to constantly refer to the slide numbers and can instead show you directly on the screen exactly what you're looking at. So if everything is coming through properly, my mouse should be appearing. So, I'm trying to record my screen, and hopefully this will make things a little bit easier for everyone else. But anyway, moving forward, we can dive right into the main content of the lecture for today, and that is the early Middle Ages and the migration of peoples. And let me get this little thing out of the way. Yes, so the early Middle Ages and the migration of peoples. Today we're going to be talking about the Middle Ages properly. We're going finally and fully into what can be considered the early Middle Ages. However, to do this, we will have to meet the groups who invaded the Roman Empire. Now, I will sometimes end up using the term barbarian here. As I have mentioned before, the term originates in ancient Greece, where they seem to have taken something of an attitude that everyone who wasn't like them spoke this sort of onomatopoeia that sounds like bar, 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 bar. Literally just B-A-R repeated over and over again. It's not a great term to describe groups. It's very, very sort of disparaging. Of course, usually the names come from Roman or other sources that viewed them as being so barbaric. They are often blanket terms for coalitions or groups, less specific individuals. So, moving forward, to give you an image of the full length of the Roman Empire, back on this screen right here, you can see the Roman Empire was quite massive by the time it ended, and you had many of these battles illustrating how far, particularly in Chalon in 451 and in Adrianople in 378, to show you the extent of how far these people were traveling. So, the Roman frontier was heavily defended, but even so it was often threatened by the groups beyond these borders. Incoming groups were accepted and dispersed within the empire, ensuring that they did not remain a coherent threat. Outside the borders, they either outright fought with opposing groups or supported client kings to keep their neighbors from causing trouble. But in this period, a group called the Huns began moving west. Now, since they don't have a written language, we're dependent on the scattered materials written about them, but not written by them, to sort of track their movements. And you can see up here the origins of where the Huns would finally settle over here in now what is modern-day Eastern Europe. So, are they the same as the Huns? Are they the same as one of the tribal groups that were threatening China to the north some generations earlier? Are they even the same group that came within range of Persia or the Eastern Empire? We're not entirely sure. We don't know really much about their political situation or how contiguous they remain as a group, or why they start moving in the first place and start pushing further towards the west. But their movement starts or is part of a cascade of peoples moving to the borders of Rome. For Rome, this really kicks off with the Goths. In 376, Rome makes a miscalculation that proves to be catastrophic. The Goths, one of many tribal confederations on the move away from the Huns, arrive at the Danube River. Then, the Danube River being the border of Rome. They seek permission to cross, and it is granted. But the Goths are a large, diverse group, and Rome is neither capable of dispersing their military might across the wide Roman Empire, so they aren't a threat, nor are they willing to support the Goths as they settle in this new land. By the end of the century, things have come to a head. In the early years of the 5th century, a large group of Goths, specifically known as the Visigoths, who are listed here in the purple color, start moving west. In 410, they reach Rome and sack it, the first time Rome has fallen to non-Romans in over 800 years. Eventually, then, they move to settle in the Iberian Peninsula, which is this general location over here, which would be the area where we see modern-day Spain and Portugal, where they settle before they are pushed a bit further south into Africa. Although the sacking of Rome was quite a shock, this does not spell the end for Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire is largely untouched, and while the Goths now have taken away the province of Hispania, even they are granted honorary titles from Rome and use Rome as a source of legitimacy. However, soon the Huns arrive on Rome's borders themselves. The Huns were not a wholly homogeneous group, but merged allies and conquered forces, especially Goths, under their banners. They led several attacks on Rome, of which the final and most famous ones came under a gentleman by the name of Attila, who you may be familiar with, or you may have at least heard the name Attila before. In the first years of the 450s, Attila struck deep into Roman territory, even threatening the city of Rome itself. Withdrawing for the winter, it seemed likely that Attila would return in the spring to attack Rome again, but suddenly in 453 he died. The Huns fracture and within a few short years decline to a minor power before dispersing entirely. Rome survives this attack, but the cracks are starting to show, particularly in the Western Roman Empire, and people are starting to realize how weak the Western Roman Empire has become. 2 years later, the Vandals also sack Rome as they move west. Their sack of Rome ended up immortalizing their name through the modern term Vandal for someone who destroys property. But in truth, their actions aren't appreciably worse than any other quote-unquote barbarian group. Traveling through Spain, they move over to North Africa, wresting it from Roman rule. And thus you have this whole area along North Africa where the Vandals settle. So, they take over rule of the Roman population in what the Romans would have referred to as Libya, once again, not necessarily referring to the modern country of Libya. But at this time, the Vandals established their own kingdom in North Africa, which was an economically vibrant region and a crucial supply of Rome's grain and resources. Their loss of these regions further destabilizes the Western Roman Empire by denying them the economic resources they need to defend the frontier. Rome begins its decline from a city of hundreds of thousands down to its medieval low in the tens of thousands. In the midst of all of this, you also have the Suevi come through. They settle in Spain, where they are conquered or incorporated with the Visigoths there. But another change is underway. Over the 2 decades after the Vandals sack Rome, the quote-unquote barbarians are no longer trying to paint themselves as subsidiaries of Rome, taking charge of administration of provinces with Roman legitimization. They begin building Romes of their own, cutting Rome out of the equation entirely. And this is illustrated particularly well in this image right here. So, in 476, you have the Ostrogoths who sack Rome. Rome never recovers, and the last remnants of the Western Roman Empire's political structure fade away. By 568, the Lombards settle in Italy. And you can see in this image the sort of way in which Western Europe kind of fractured once the Roman Empire itself fell through. But yet, once again, the Ostrogoths sacked Rome and established the Lombards who settled in Italy. Beyond the Eastern Roman Empire's presence in Naples and Sicily, which you can see here, such as the Duchy of Spoleto, as well as Sardinia, Sicily, so on and so forth, the Romans don't end up... I apologize, let me back up. So by 568, the Lombards settle in Italy beyond the Eastern Roman Empire's presence in Naples and Sicily, and the Bishop of Rome's extensive holdings, eventually to be known as the Papal States. There is no Roman rule in Italy. Now, there are a couple of things we need to be cautious when we refer to this as a fall of Rome. First of all, though you can see the paths of these people through the Eastern Roman Empire, they don't end up settling there. So yes, the people don't end up settling over here, even though they are pushing into the area of the Eastern Roman Empire. Although it has taken some major hits and lost its western twins, the Eastern Roman Empire, relying on the large economic power of the Western Mediterranean, continues to survive and even thrive under rulers such as Justinian. So while this area collapses, as illustrated by this map over here, this remaining bit of the Roman Empire, what we refer to as the Eastern Roman Empire, remains and keeps thriving. Furthermore, it is also important to note that the sediment of all these people moving around into the former regions of the Roman Empire, all of these migrations and settlements do not necessarily mean the wholesale slaughter and destruction or forced emigration of the people that were originally or already living there. Often these barbarians inherit Roman structures and systems, adapting them to their own systems and adapting themselves, particularly culturally. For many, barbarian conquest just meant new landowners, and many landowners found it safer to come to accommodation with the incoming forces rather than hold out for the return of Rome. Or rather, the return of Roman authority, which, as it ultimately turned out, never came back again. So, we've talked a little bit about Spain and the Visigoths, but we will come back to them another day. Instead, we are going to focus on the regions primarily of what was Roman Gaul and Roman England, which eventually come to the names Francia and later England. Between these two regions, you have a group of people in France known as the Franks, and up in England known as the Anglo-Saxons. And both of them were groups of people who emigrated into these regions and sort of staked their claim and made kingdoms within these regions. And culturally speaking, both the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons in their respective areas had a massive impact, particularly culturally, on the developing medieval European world. So, who are these people? The Franks and the Anglo-Saxons have many close similarities. Both Old Frankish and Old English are languages with a Germanic base. You can see here a visualization of the branching of world languages. While reality is really much more complex than this. Branches intersect and intermingle more than you can really see in this image. You can see here how German and English share this quote-unquote Germanic branch, while languages like modern French and Spanish belong more to the Romance branch, because they are closer to Latin. And just in case it's not clear, when people refer to the Romance languages, which include Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, languages from that part of the world. When they say Romance languages, Romance comes from the word Roman, and it does not mean romance as we understand it now. So, both Franks and Anglo-Saxons come from across the Rhine in the region the Romans called Germania, which looks very similar to our modern-day Germany. Their social structure was based upon a series of interrelated tribes and king groups ruled by world warlords and petty kings. Crucial to the military power of these peoples is the comitatus system. The comitatus system is a sort of retinue of thanes and lords. Powerful figures maintain large mead halls where they entertain the members of the comitatus. By positioning themselves as figures who could provide gifts and feasts to their people, they indebted these followers, the comitatus, to them. This obligation was repaid through loyalty and especially military service. Kin ties were also vitally important, another way through which civic ties and obligations were enforced. Their culture was dependent on a warrior society, a quote-unquote heroic culture. It relied heavily on concepts of manliness and boldness, as well as the maintenance of honor. In such a culture, shame is clearly delineated from guilt. Shame is when honor is lost. It is a public, not a private matter. Honor was something to be competed for. If someone was wronged, if someone was shamed in any way, honor was lost and had to be reclaimed. It almost took on a tangible, almost currency-like format, I guess you could say. People understood honor as something you either had or you didn't have, and you had it in various degrees. And oftentimes, people at the top of the social ladder were also people who were associated with generally having more honor. And oftentimes, shame is the inverse of this. Having shame is essentially having a negative currency. It's like accumulating a debt of honor. Both cultures had a broadly shared religious identity. Worship was polytheistic with a core pantheon of Woden, which is just the Germanic version of the term Odin, Thunor, the Germanic version of Thor, Tu, the Germanic version of Tyr, and Frigga, the Germanic version of the Norse god Frigg. The alternate names may be more familiar to you, as they are names often used by the Norse centuries later, who seem to have followed a broadly similar pantheon. While temples were constructed, more of worship was built around landscape features such as trees, stones, and wells. Many of these sites were either converted, with churches built to replace the sites, but many more lived on as local folklore in the wake of conversion. Emphasis was placed on the role of the weird or fate. Animal sacrifice was common in religious rites, and large funeral rites were considered important. While kings were not necessarily ordained by gods, they are expected to play a role as religious leaders, even serving as priests in many cases. Some of these attitudes and aspects are tenacious and also survive conversion. So moving forward, we're going to start talking about the main people that inhabited this area right here, known as Francia. These people were known as the Franks. So as the Franks crossed the Rhine, they settle in what is referred to once again as Francia, modern-day France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and much or most of Germany. However, they were a very loosely banded group of tribes, united by a broadly common culture and set of kin groups until Clovis I. Clovis I, the son of a petty king, succeeded him at age 15. Or rather, I should reword that. Clovis succeeded his father, a petty king, by the age of 15. By age 20, he had conquered much of the remnants of the Roman Empire through a series of war and strategic alliances. Through lawmaking, he helped ensure the long-term success of Francia and the dynasty he founded, the Merovingians. He combined the roles of creating kingdoms, crafting laws, and determining his realm's faith. His wife played an important role in all of this, converting and convincing him to follow suit. Because of her role, she was sainted, and images such as these, showing her holding a church, reflecting her role establishing religious institutions in Francia. Clovis was baptized on Christmas Day of 508. The mass conversion of his realm brought him in line with the papal authority of Rome, one of the last authorities the city represented. In doing so, we see the increasing power of bishops, as the letters in your primary source packet show, as they tried to control the behaviors of the king. And the general import of the conversion of Clovis is well established through a lot of the art that comes out through the Middle Ages and even after the Middle Ages, because it was recognized as sort of the establishing point for what would later become one of the most powerful kingdoms of the Middle Ages, France, and its Christianization. So it would continue to be a major aspect of art later on in medieval French and even early modern French history. Now, one of the most important things Clovis I does is to develop the law codes known as the Salic Law. Now, these laws aren't really his innovation. This is a codification of common law, unwritten, but known to those who used it. In order to administer a larger realm, a written, codified set of laws ensures consistent application across the realm and over time. What you see commonly in such law codes, some of them are presented in your primary source packet, is the practice of weregild. Weregild is a common feature of Germanic societies, where instead of jail time or physical punishments, fines are imposed. They are scaled based upon the severity of the crime, a way to solve a loss of honor without violence. So moving from the Franks, we are about to start talking about the last group for the day, and that is the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons started as a group of tribes, namely the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who arrived in what is today England from northern Germany and Denmark in the 5th century. Prior to this, Roman military forces had withdrawn from Britain, leaving it in a precarious position. Arriving as much as a warrior elite as a full population, they steadily pushed west, absorbing the local people. Their advance stalls before they push the conquest through all of Cornwall and Wales, which is why the modern Welsh language is so different from English. Their advance into modern-day Scotland is fairly limited, just as Rome's was. The Anglo-Saxons convert in 597, but unlike the Franks, their conversion does not come at the same time as political unification. Instead, they remain a series of scattered kingdoms until King Eadred in 954. The name of these kingdoms, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, and so on, referred to these original groups. The Angles and the Western, Southern, and Eastern Saxon kingdoms. As you can see, like, East Saxons would be Essex, South Saxons would be Sussex, West Saxons would be Wessex. You would have Middle Anglia, where the Angles would settle in the middle of the island. East Anglia would be where you would get the East Angle, so on and so forth. And many of these regions are still existent and named such in modern-day England. Until the time of the conversion, their language, which we now call Old English, was almost entirely spoken. Their history and stories were preserved through oral tradition until conversion restored the use of the Latin alphabet in the region. You can see the first lines of the Dream of the Rood in your primary source packet. As you can see, this language, Old English, is very different from our modern English. Huge changes occur in the language, as this one is much more Germanic rather than the modern English, which pulls heavily from Latin, Greek, and Old French. Runes, as you can see in the top left of this slide, were another alphabet used, but not as a writing method to describe the long, detailed stories of our texts. Instead, they were used to inscribe spells, names, and small passages on objects. For them, poetry was an important form of expression with strict rules and forms. The material culture found is often beautifully decorated, with spectacular manuscripts and armors. With the image in the bottom right of this slide being a perfect example of a reconstruction of a type of helmet that would have been used by an Anglo-Saxon. And as you can see, very richly decorated and very ornate. Very, very skilled craftsmen. Now, this brings us to Christianity in Anglo-Saxon society. As you may have noticed while working on your source analysis, if you have started it already, they imagine some of the scenes differently than the Bible would suggest. And if you ended up reading Matthew 16, you will see how clearly this comes through. Now, we've discussed some of the pagan heroic values of their society. Perhaps that helps us explain what we see in the Dream of the Rood. When we tried to picture the rood of the text, perhaps we should imagine one much like the Ruthwell cross, which you can see right here. Once again, very decorative and ornate. The front and back show biblical scenes, but the sides have the branches and leaves of a depiction of the world tree, a part of how they visualize the cosmos. The tradition and visual motifs of the old faith are merged with the new one to create a distinct visual style and perspective on Christianity. This is a very important thing to pay attention to, particularly when you are reading the Dream of the Rood. Understanding the origins of sort of the Germanic myth as well as this warrior culture society. Draw comparisons between that and biblical depictions of Jesus and his crucifixion. This will help you a whole lot to think about that, this fusion of this Anglo-Saxon warrior society with biblical scripture that presents things in a slightly different way. Alright, this is the end of our last lecture for the week. On Monday, we will be discussing some writing resources, and I will have a short lecture to talk about writing for this class and the subjects we cover more generally. Hopefully, they will help you make better source analyses and better essays as we go forward. I will also start taking a look at your first source analysis as they come in, and try to get feedback back to you as soon as possible. So, remember, your grades are whatever I assess them to be. However, the best way to improve your grade is to read whatever feedback I provide you. This is very important to keep in mind because I pay very close attention whether or not you are employing the feedback that I suggest for you. Anyway, after talking about the writing workshop and all of the writing resources I will have for you, we will again spend some time in the Middle East, and this time to follow the growth of a new faith, Islam.